بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, we've been looking at the chapter on ijara, and we looked that there are two types of ajir, of person who's hired: ajir mushtarak and ajir khas. And there are distinct rulings related to the two. You do well to break this down into a simple chart. That these are the core rulings that are mentioned in Quduri. Those who want to look further, we've pointed towards where you could find more extensive rulings in the Majalla, for example. Then he mentions some of the things that are permitted and not permitted to hire for, right? So that, and we look at what some of the underlying principles are, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So he tells us, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَيَجُوزُ أَخْذُ أُجْرَةِ الْحَمَّامِ. It is permitted to take ujra, to take the payment for the use of a public bath. What's the problem with hiring for a public bath? What would the problem be? No, forget, no.
Are you renting the time or the use?
Yeah. So there's loads of problems conceptually. That's okay. You pay. Let's say we have kilo hammam, kilo premium hammam, KPM, right? Kilo premium hammam of Mississauga for gents, KPMG, right? Which is the name of a famous company as well, of course. So kilo premium hammam, you give $50 and you can use the hammam. Now the problem is that what are you paying for? Are you paying for, how much water will be used, how much soap will be used, how many towels will you use? Al-ma'qud alayhi is undefined, right? What if you don't use all the services? Say, I didn't use a towel because I don't like your towels. Give me $3 back. I didn't use your soap because I'm allergic to soap, or I no longer use soap, right? But does this kind of service normally lead to dispute, right? So it's permitted to take, and likewise permitted to pay. Akhdhu ujratil hammam, permitted to take and permitted to give. There's an important principle, of course, that we shouldn't forget, that ما لا يجوز تناوله لا يجوز إعطاؤه. That which is not permitted to take is not permitted to give, right? ما لا يجوز تناوله لا يجوز إعطاؤه. That which is not permitted to take is not permitted to give. Now, there's numerous furu', details that clarify a point that not every non-definition is problematic in a contract. So non-definition in a contract is makruh, not in itself, is mamnu'. الجهالة ممنوعة شرعا لأنها تفضي إلى النزاع. Because it could lead to dispute. So non-definition in a contract is problematic because it could lead to dispute. But they say that تعامل الناس رافع للنزاع, right? Right? That people's customary practice lifts the possibility of dispute. Leave aside the hammam, a gym membership. What do you pay for a gym membership? You pay for a gym membership. You could use the gym. How many times are you going to use the gym? Of course, it's understood it's only one person, but you know, can someone come and most people, actually gyms are designed not to be used. Right? There's a lot of studies about it. Right? They're designed, if any gym had everyone coming regularly, they'd have to shut down because they wouldn't be able to afford it. So, what happens? Could someone come and complain, I didn't use the gym this month, pay me back? No. People don't fight over gym membership unless they're being unreasonable or something went wrong, but in the regular case. So that definition does not cause dispute. And this would apply to sales as well. Is a buffet lunch halal? What's the problem with a buffet lunch? So you have kilos of shawarma, shawarma. What's the problem with it? You pay $12, $15, but what am I getting? What? Is that defined? No. Is it defined though? Did we agree on how much I'd eat? No. So the faqih, when they look at that first, they say that's problematic. We didn't agree on what you are paying for. That's problematic. But do people have fights over buffets? No. Unless you do something wrong. Two sisters slipped in and said, just pretend you're sick and we'll eat together. Right? Or someone sits under what are you going to do? Right? You pay per plate. So, certain non-definition is problematic initially, but if it does not lead to dispute, then it's not problematic. Now, if you were the first person who came with a buffet lunch, would a faqih say that this is allowed? He said, we will validate it. They'd suggest a validation, right? Which is, for example, say, define a maximum amount. That's one of the simple ways of validating it, right? That you can eat as much as you want to a limit of 5 plates, as long as you're the only person eating. Right? Now there's other issues. Right? There's other issues with the buffet, but we leave those aside. Are you buying the food? Are you what is the ruling of that food? Right? But we'll leave that aside. So this is the issue of of the hammam, right? That this, though the usage is not defined, but it's a non-definition that does not lead to dispute. And similar things would have to do with gym memberships and so on, right? Where the specific, what exactly are you using is not specifically defined, but it's effectively defined. Wal hajjam. The hajjam is the one who does hijama, cupping, right? Because though there are some discouragements about paying for cupping and so on. It's also established the Prophet ﷺ paid for someone to do his cupping, right? So it's permissible because it's a known action for a known price, right? And sometimes, some non-definition that exactly where you want the cupping, etc., doesn't lead to dispute, right? ولا يجوز أخذ أجرة عسب التيس. Right? It's not permitted to take, to hire out. What's عسب التيس?
Animals together for mating.
Yeah, right? So someone has a prize bull. So you can't rent out your bull for the purpose of mating, right? That's the default because, but now some of the ulama will argue, it's a dispute, contemporary, this is now very common practice, right? That if it's defined in a clear manner, etc., would that, so one is that, would that now be allowed? Some would argue from a ethical perspective of, and they also do it with prize horses, etc. So selling, selling animals, semen or eggs for the purpose of mating, that is highly problematic. Actual mating of animals and having a payment for that, the asl of the madhab is it's not permitted. Paying just for animals to mate. And one of the wisdoms being that these should be things that are shared amongst people, right? Amongst neighboring farmers and so on. But also, what exactly are you hiring for? It's not something that the Sharia considered. But the counter argument is that though there are texts against this, right? They're built on a custom where this was not a price that was customarily paid for something. And the permitting argument is that in our times, this is something that people customarily pay for, and something having material value returns to whether people consider it to be a material. So you could put that there's some contemporary khilaf. And then ولا يجوز الاستئجار على الأذان والإقامة والحج. You cannot hire someone to give the adhan or the iqama or the hajj or to lead prayer or to teach the Quran. This is in the commentary, or to teach the Quran or to teach fiqh, right? And Alama Qasim in the Tasheeh, as quoted in the Lubab, he said this is the position of the early scholars, because the acts of worship are to be done only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. وَأَجَازَهُ الْمُتَأَخِّرُونَ. The later scholars did allow it. The later scholars, like the later early scholars, because in the Hidayah it mentions, right, that some of our scholars deemed good to allow hiring to teach the Quran, and the fatwa is upon that, and is also chosen by An-Nasafi, etc. Right? And similar in the Muhit al-Burhani, etc. Right? And it's mentioned also in the Dhakhira, which has recently been published, alhamdulillah, that it entails a binding contract, right? Right? And likewise for the fatwas, it's permitted to hire someone to teach fiqh, etc. But for things that are purely the pure ibadah of adhan or iqama, right? There's no need for it, because anyone can give the adhan, anyone can give the iqama, anyone can. But the ulama generally preferred to separate between two things, to support the ulama, and that's been the historic precedent in most Muslim lands. While they legally allowed this, the historic precedent was, because there are great harms in knowledge becoming, and to have 25% discounts on knowledge and this and that. This is not one unbecoming of knowledge. Knowledge is not for sale. But also, it affects the intentions of those teaching and the ta'zeem of the one studying, and so on, right? I know somebody who's like, so cool, I can study Islam in my underwear. And they send me this text and said, oops, got Allah upset. I said, what happened? Said the lights went out, so the internet went down. Because it was like, there's a storm going on. But, that's not, but there's it clearly affects intentions, right? And that's why in every place, so there's difference between taking someone earning because they're teaching or being an imam, etc. But to separate that from a transactional thing is very, 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 very important, right? So that the ulama would be supported and conditions would be put on their support, right? So it's binding, but it's not transactional, that the people coming, learning from so you have membership to to be able to get, and it has it. So there's a legal basis, because the ilm is min bab al-ibadah. So the act of worship, it's obvious, but even ilm from bab al-ibadah. For people to be supported for it, generally separating the two matters is anzah, is much, much clearer. It affects people's intentions. There's many people, if someone can't do it, liwajhillah, it's better for them not to do it than to find, well, if they're paid, they'll do it more, then tarku mithlihi awla. There's someone who studied with me a couple of years, and they were going to go do graduate studies. So one of my teachers said, if he asks you, it's up to you, but if he asks you for ijazah or something, consider giving it a miss. He said, because I've suggested that before they do graduate studies, they go and work for 2 years in something completely unrelated to religious studies, as a test that if you can come back and dedicate after having so one is so that people experience the dunya, so to understand what people go through, but secondly, are you willing to leave the dunya for the amal al-akhirah? If you're not, then religious work is better off without you. Right? If someone wouldn't dedicate themselves to amal al-akhirah, such as religious work, why? Because I'm comfortable in my job and this and that, then great. Be comfortable in your dunya and don't ruin your deen by doing deen for the sake of dunya. Right? But this is a serious fitna that as a community we have to address. Individuals have their individual circumstances, right? Someone say, okay, why am I teaching Quran? Because I can make a living that way. That's really problematic. It's really problematic. Right? Now we're collectively responsible. That person there, that's the only thing they're able to do. But collectively it's very harmful. And then so many people aren't able to access the things that they need in their religion. Al-Hasan al-Basri said, عقوبة أهل العلم موت القلب. The punishment for the people of knowledge is the death of their hearts. And he was asked, وَكَيْفَ ذَلِكَ? He says, how would that be? He said, بِطَلَبِ الدُّنْيَا بِعَمَلِ الْآخِرَةِ, by seeking the dunya, by actions of the next life. But we collectively have a responsibility with those kinds of things, right? There's a special sale going on for Aqidah, right? And the people who conveyed this to us said, لا نسألكم عليه أجرا. We do not ask you for any part. Yeah, that's it, you know. ولا الغناء والنوح. It's not, you know, it's not permitted to hire for impermissible things, such as prohibited singing, right? So, you know, that's the receiving the payment is haram. الغناء, the al here is referential. أي الغناء المحرم, prohibited singing, right? Prohibited music. والنوح, and for wailers. And wailers, people would hire wailers for people's funerals, right? Prohibited, right? And likewise, other impermissible modes of entertainment, right? Because it's hire for sin, and hiring for sin is not permitted, right? So these are some of the types of hire that are permitted or not permitted. The contracts, and we have to be careful about this. You know, your electricity bill is a contract. Your cell phone plan is a contract. You know, there's all kinds of contracts, and it's good to think through what are the terms of this contract, right? Now, formal contracts, of course, are designed not to lead to dispute, right? But there are unjust contracts out there. Sometimes you're just allowing yourself to be harmed because you allow yourself to be kidded. But contracts do not have to be with payment, right? And something is not an actual contract, but it's effectively a contract. It's effectively a contract. So for example, when you use free commercial services, there's a contract. There's a contract. Why? Because they let you access in a commercial service. They're not doing it for, Gmail is not offered lillahi rabbil alameen. They did not put together Gmail, nawaitu taqarruba ila Allah. I intend to draw. Rather, you are giving something in exchange for this service, right? And the price you're paying is very high. When you're using Facebook, it's not a contract. It's not a higher contract formally because there's no material payment, but there's a payment. But it's a good personal ethical practice to consider that what kind of transaction is this? And you're always paying for something. One is you're paying for your privacy. I had some trackers off just briefly, right? And suddenly I get all these people, I get suggested as friends on Facebook. Why? Because usually I have all these trackers up. Nope, but I wanted to run a little experiment. Suddenly I get all these friends recommendations. So who are these people? Wife of somebody I know, son of somebody I know, first cousin of somebody I know. Why are they recommended? Because my trackers are down, they're now tracking. Then I have to clean it out again. Right? I get all kinds of recommendations. I have a new mic coming. Muhammad doesn't know yet. But suddenly I get all these music ads. Why? Because I ordered a mic. So you're giving up your private, you're paying for things effectively. So, but we should think that in any transaction, what am I giving? What's coming? In formal transactions, it's legally not an issue. But in informal transactions, you have to be careful. Like we talked about when you're hiring, right? You also have to think about there's many things that people just consider normal. They normalize it. But it's highly problematic. You get a subscription service to something questionable. How is that payment halal? How is that payment halal? What are you paying for? Right? And if you were to think a little bit, it would save you. I know somebody who spent, according to their own thing, at least $10,000 on video games 2 years in a row. On not video game, like just because now most games are free, but you pay for all kinds of things. $10,000. Now if you pause, what are you paying for? What are you paying for? So one needs to think, because a lot of these things are, is it valid or not? That's one aspect, but is it meaningful or not? Certainly there'll be dislike. So anything that people consider to be of customary value. So we would not say that buying add-ons for NBA, whatever, is a new, I don't know what it's called anymore, but, right? That it's haram, but certainly it's makruh. Because what are you doing? Wasting your money on these kinds of things. So that needs some awareness. But it's good to ask oneself these questions. So we'll stop there for Maghrib, inshallah, and then we'll come back and look at other types of transactions that are not permitted. Walhamdulillah. Okay, Bismillah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Then he says, ولا تجوز إجارة المشاع عند أبي حنيفة إلا من الشريك وقالا إجارة المشاع جائزة. Right? So the musha', if property is shared, it can be in two ways. Right? Right? So let's say two sisters own a cottage in Northern Ontario. Right? One of them rents it out to me for $500 for 2 weeks. There's a problem though, which is that if two people own something 50%, and one of them rents me 50% of the cottage, how can I use 50% of the cottage? Is it possible? Right? Because you own 50%, you own 50%. Right? She's really relaxed, because she's very wealthy, she's very relaxed, do whatever you want. But you're very particular. So I go in there, I don't know what I can use and what I can't, we're going to have a fight, and the Sharia is not, aim is, so there not be dispute. So the ownership of something can be, like if there's shared ownership, so two people own a house. Can you own a house together? Yes. Right? Your 50% ownership can be musha', which is both of you own 50% of the whole house. Which part of the house do each of you own? It's non-defined. That's the musha'. And we will see later what can you do with that. There's chapters related to that. Because one of the things, because if two people own a property together, that's musha', what do? You can agree to how the two of you will use it. One of the ways, it's called muhayya'a, that okay, if you own it 50%, you agree 50% of the time to you, 50% of the time to the other person. If you can't agree, then we make qisma, then we separate. You own, and you either agree to divide the property. So okay, it was like a mirrored property, the two halves of the property. We build a wall down the middle. Or you say, okay. I visited a friend of mine's father in Lahore. He said, I am a stupid old man. Because what he did, he got fed up with how much he was having to pay to water his lawn. So he decided to cement the whole backyard. It's a big garden. It looked really weird. Right? Like you have not just a small, like a big, it's bigger than this hall, like much bigger, right? Big backyard. It's just cemented. And he uses other colorful language to describe it. He says, now I have to get it all dug up and use it. I said, so uncle, how's your son doing? But now if something is owned between two people, then how can you rent it out? Right? So there's shared property. How can you rent it out? Unless you rent it to each other. How? Let's say you guys had agreed that in the summers, I'll use the cottage 50% of the time, I'll use it for 50% of the time. But then what happens? Someone's got a whole slew of family coming this summer to Canada. They say, I need it all summer. Are you okay? I said, no, I'm not okay with it. Because we want to use the cottage during the summer. So okay, I'll rent your share of it from you. That's fine. Illa min ash-sharik. Right? in shared property. But the Sahibain said that this is permitted. Right? That you can rent a shared property. How? By the assumption of agreement, and that ta'amulun nas, that people do rent things like that out without it leading to dispute. How? Two people own the property 50-50, right? So they had agreed amongst themselves on their usage of the property. So if I come, I know that the title deed of this property belongs to two people. One of them rents it out to me. I would assume reasonably that this is within their reasonable usage of their own property, right? And this does not lead to dispute, right? Either bitakhliya, one person allowed the other to use it, or it was called bitahayu, tahayu, which is mentioned in the commentary. Tahayu, this is also called muhaya'a. It's where they agree to an alternating usage system, right? So they agree. In the summer, June is for you, July is for you, August or whatever. Like they agree, May, June, July, August, September, 5 months of usage. We divide them 2.5 months each, or 2 weekends, whatever is reasonable. And the renting party will just assume that I'm using it with fair usage. Where these things lead to dispute, there would be local laws related to that, even in Muslim societies, of what is allowed and what's not allowed to preserve public interest, right? And here, most of the later scholars gave fatwa on the position of Imam Abu Hanifa in this, right? In terms of the strength of the original position, right? But there's khilaf with respect to the issue of, is this muta'araf? Is this customarily known? Right? This is customarily known, right? 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 Because the issue would be that it would lead to dispute, right? But many of these issues, if custom is established on this, if one partner is customarily allowed to rent out their property, then it will be valid. Of course, this is assuming that there's no permission from the other party. But if there's permission, then khalas, Then he said, وَيَجُوزُ اسْتِئْجَارُ الذِّئْرِ بِأُجْرَةٍ مَعْلُومَةٍ. It's permitted to hire a wet nurse for a known for known amount. Problem is, how much is she nursing? Right? Like, I've never seen a nursometer, something that measures how much milk is coming out. Right? Why? But this is not something that leads to dispute. Right? Now, if the nurse fails to give milk, then it would be grounds to cancel the contract, etc. And the sunnah would be that you end the contract in a good way, but nothing is due beyond that. Right? وَيَجُوزُ بِطَعَامِهَا وَكِسْوَتِهَا. And it's permitted to hire a wet nurse in exchange for her food and clothing. Again, because there's custom for this. That people, there'd be people come from the village, etc. Say, we'll feed you and clothe you, and and you nurse, and this too, it does not lead to dispute. Right? And this existed during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, right? People used to hire wet nurses, and the Prophet ﷺ did not prohibit it. But that gives a principle, right? That certain things, if there's non-definition, but there's a sound custom. But the critical thing is the faqih has to know be aware of the consequences and implications of actions, so that they can give, so that they can judge that does this lead to dispute? Does it cause problems? Right? وليس للمستأجر أن يمنع زوجها من وطئها فإن حبلت كان لهم أن يفسخوا الإجارة إذا خافوا على الصبي من لبنها وعليها أن تصلح طعام الصبي. But the one who's hiring the services of a wet nurse cannot prohibit her husband to have intercourse with her, right? Because that's outside the scope of their contract. But if she does get pregnant, they have the right to cancel the contract if there's grounds for fear on her ability to nurse. A wet nurse is, what is customarily known, al-ma'lumu urfan kal-mashruti shartan. That which is customarily known is as if contractually stipulated. So he says, وَعَلَيْهَا أَن تُصْلِحَ طَعَامَ الصَّبِي. It is upon her, meaning the nurse, the wet nurse, to prepare the food of the child, insofar as that this would be customarily from what's expected of the wet nurse, right? What is customarily expected is as if contractually stipulated, right? This applies in sales contracts, and it applies in, so if you ordered pizza, right? And they asked you what toppings, you said mushroom and black olives. And this pizza came, there's a pie, got mushroom and black olives, but there's no sauce and there's no cheese. Right? It is understood customarily that pizza is base plus sauce plus cheese. Toppings are extra, right? But imagine, so you ordered pizza and you just got, because what is customarily known is as if contractually stipulated. Now, if you stipulated in the contract that the pizza with no sauce, no cheese, then you agreed to it. But otherwise, you have a right to refund. So you didn't ask for it. I didn't have to. The same principle applies to hire. Right? Imagine if you rented a property in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and you went there, the property's fine, but there is no running water in the house. It's not connected to the running water. Right? Kilo Enterprises said, we don't cover kilowatts of energy. So we don't want you to cover it, but it's not connected to the grid. I would have grounds to cancel the contract, because it's customarily understood. But if you hire a wet nurse, you're hiring her for her nursing. وَإِنْ أَرْضَعَتْهُ فِي الْمُدَّةِ بِلَبَنِ شَاةٍ فَلَا أَجْرَ لَهَا. If during the time period that she was hired to nurse for, she nursed the child with animal milk, not her own milk, then there's no payment due for her. But the better thing is to have things in writing, right? Have things in writing. When is payment due? Can get tricky. And it depends on the type of work. Right, so if you hire somebody, when is payment due? Of course, we've taken principles before. If they agree to paying upfront or in installments, or the payment is made upfront, then khalas, that's taken care of. Otherwise, when does it become due? It says, وَكُلُّ صَانِعٍ لِعَمَلِهِ أَثَرٍ فِي الْعَيْنِ كَالْقَصَّارِ وَالسَّبَاغِ فَلَهُ أَنْ يَحْبِسَ الْعَيْنِ حَتَّى الْفَرَاغِ من عمله بعد الفراغ من عمله حتى يستوفي الأجرة. Any service صانع here, any service provider whose work has a tangible effect on the item that they had to do work over, such as someone who, what's the qassar? The one who is bleaching a garment, right? Their work has a tangible effect on the item, or the dyer, right? Or the one who does embroidery, for example, right? They are allowed to make habs, they're allowed to hold on to the item that they did the work on after completing their work until they're paid. Similarly, the mechanic, right, they repaired the car, has tangible effect on the item. So I'll pay you later. Unless he agrees, say no. Pay me and then I'll release your car. Unless they'd agreed to deferred payment or something, right? وَمَنْ لَيْسَ لِعَمَلِهِ أَثَرٌ فَلَيْسَ هُ أَنْ يَحْبِسَ الْعَيْنِ. Right? And whoever's work does not have a tangible effect on the thing that they worked on, then they can't hold on to the item until they're paid. Such as what? You went to get your car assessed. You have an antique car, so you took it to get a thorough assessment and a certificate of authenticity or certificate of antiquity. So they spend several days making sure that it's the right model, this and that. So you owe them $500. So you have to pay. But can they hold on to your car? The root position of the madhab is no. The later scholars frequently look at custom and so on these matters, right? وَمَنْ كَالْحَمَّالِ, it's like the one carrying an item, right? So someone who transports an item. So they carried the item from place A to place B. They got to the destination, said, pay me. Said, well, Baba's not here, so I'm not going to give it to you. You can't. Right? Now, if you wanted the payment in advance, etc., then you stipulate accordingly. If you didn't, then they can pay after. Right? Wal mallah is the sailor, right? The one who, or the one who owns a ship, right? Because the work there was carrying. The work was not related to what you are carrying. So you can't hold on to that. وإذا اشترط على الصانع أن يعمل بنفسه فليس له أن يستعمل غيره. If the condition was made that the craftsmen do the work themselves, it is not contractually permissible for them to use somebody else. Right? Because if you went to a tailor, what they're responsible for is that they tailor to specifications. Right? Let's say all of you turn into one the Seekers Tailoring Company, right? STC. So I entered into a contract with the entrepreneur, right? That's a simple job. She gave it to one of the junior people in the tailoring firm. I get upset. Said, "Did you do it?" I said, "Nah, it's a straightforward job." I can't complain. Why? Because I didn't stipulate that you do it. But if we agreed contractually, I want this tailor to do it, then they're bound by that. And that mal would have hurma in it, be permissible. Right? And I could refuse to take it. And this is why it's recommended. Right? And then at the end, we're going to look at some of the adab, or what they call akhlaqiyat. And Shaykh, one of the really useful summaries of this is by a contemporary scholar, Shaykh Wahb Zuhaili, who took some of the classical things, but it's recommended to make one's dealings with trustworthy people. Right? This is one of the, and there's practical benefits in it as well, because that is more distant from from what you're dealing with to be affected by the haram or shubuhat, etc. Right? Even with food. Someone asked, and sometimes it's hard to implement these things. We lead complicated lives and stuff. But one of my teachers, Shaykh Muhammad Juma, was asked that what's the ruling of these French cheeses that are imported? Shaykh Muhammad Juma said, "إيش بدك فيها?" What do you want these imported cheeses? He says, خذ لك قاعدة, take a principle. كل طعام مسته المصانع ففيه شبهة. I said, take a principle. That any food that's been touched by a factory, there's some dubiousness in it. Right? That إيش دخل الطعام بالمصنع? So what does food have to do with a factory? Right? Food is something that grows or is made from natural things. Then go to your local milk shop if you want cheese. You know the owner, تعرف إنه you know he's someone upright. He believes, he prays. تعرف إن هذا مال طيب. Okay? And that's why they used to say that what is more important than finding, if you move houses, what's more important than having a good neighbor? The marketplace in general. And in the marketplace, the butcher, right? Because the meat you eat affects you more than other things. They say it's more important to be by a good market. Of course, they're talking the context of Muslim city, where there'll be masajid everywhere, right? That the masjid would be assumed, right? That in every place you'd have, like when we lived in Maidan, in Damascus, we only lived in Maidan. When the adhan was given, between adhan and iqama, like 5 minutes for Maghrib, I could walk to 12 mosques. A lot of them tiny little places, like literally between two houses, there's a little micro mosque, and there's some righteous man buried in there with his wife who was some distinguished saint, and like amazing. But because of this, these things lead to a lot of dispute, right? So if that's a considered consideration, that if it's stipulated that so and so do the work, then it has to be done, right? وَإِنْ أَطْلَقَ لَهُ الْعَمَلْ فَلَهُ أَنْ يَسْتَأْجِرَ مَنْ يَعْمَلُهُ. But if it's mentioned unconditioned, then it is allowed to hire someone else to do it. But al-bayanu awla, making things clear. So someone, a famous tailor or something, let's make it clear that he won't necessarily be making, or it will be supervised by. So the clearer an agreement is, the more blessed it is. But there's a balance without disadvantaging oneself. And what if there is difference of opinion? And this, of course, goes to the issue of claims in court. But there's some governing principles that relate to claim. Because if you ask someone to make something, people can differ. That's why it's sunnah to have things in writing. Sunnah to have things in writing. People err on this in these kinds of things. I know them. We won't disagree. Yeah, you don't disagree first 10 times, but then when you do, things will blow up. وَإِذَا اخْتَلَفَ الْخَيَّاطُ وَصَاحِبُ الثَّوْبِ. If the tailor and the owner of the clothing, of the cloth, differ. فَقَالَ صَاحِبُ الثَّوْبِ أَمَرْتُكَ أَن تَعْمَلَهُ قَبَاء. So the owner of the cloth said, I asked you to make it into a qaba, like a jubba. وَقَالَ الْخَيَّاطُ قَمِيصًا. And the tailor said, no, a long shirt. أو قال صاحب الثوب للصباغ. Or the owner of the cloth said to the dyer, أمرتك أن تصبغه أحمر. I asked you to dye it red. فصبغته أصفر. But you dyed it yellow or sulfur colored. فالقول صاحب الثوب. فالقول قول صاحب الثوب مع يمينه. Right? So the word of the owner of the cloth is taken with their oath, with their yameen. Why? Because it's their cloth. لأن الإذن مستفاد من جهته. Because the permission came, it's his cloth. He only agreed to give it in accordance with what he accepted. I gave it to this person so that they do it. So the default is, my word is taken, but I have to swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The yameen with an oath. I swear by Allah that this is the case. Right? وَإِذَا حَلِفَ فَالْخَيَّاطُ ضَامِنٌ. And if he swears, then the tailor or the dyer would have to compensate for the cloth. But of course, this is in the absence of proof. Right? In the absence of proof. And this is why in the tradition of guilds in Muslim societies was fascinating. So they'd agree that no tailor shall accept a job except with these things. So they set standards. Right? And these are these preserve the public interest. وإذا قال صاحب الثوب عملته لي بغير أجرة وقال الصباغ بأجرة فالقول قول صاحب الثوب مع يمينه عند أبي حنيفة. وقال أبو يوسف إن كان حريفا له فله الأجرة. وإذا لم يكن حريفا فلا أجرة له. وقال محمد إن كان الصانع معروفا بهذه الصنعة بأجرة فالقول قوله بأنه عمله بأجرة. Okay, so now an interesting case. If the owner of the cloth says that you did it for me without pay, right? You stitched it without pay, and the person said, no, there was a fee. Then, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, the opinion here again, that the initial word that is in the absence of proof, the opinion of the statement of the owner of the cloth is taken with an oath, right? Because he is denying. In this case, he is denying something. Right? And the basic principle is al-bayyinatu ala al-mudda'i. The one making a claim must bring proof. وَالْيَمِينُ عَلَى مَنْ أَنْكَرَ. And the one denying must swear an oath. So here he's denying. This is according to Abu Hanifa. Abu Yusuf said that if the owner of the cloth does this professionally, like they get clothing stitched for the purpose of selling, then it wouldn't be believed, right? So you have a tailoring shop, right? So or you sell clothing, right? So Zayn has started a turban business, but he just sells, you call it Zayni turbans, right? So he sells turbans, but he gets the caps made by this group of really expert sisters who make very precise caps, because caps are tricky to make. Why? Because at the end you have to connect the two sides together, and most if you're particular about things, and I'm just a lazy perfectionist, right? I just get annoyed by things, but I'm not going to do anything about it. Most caps, if you look at them, right, they don't line up very well. There's these blessed Bengali brothers who convinced me to being nice sells. I ended up spending a ridiculous amount on kufis during RS. I ended up buying a whole bunch. They're such nice guys, and they're trying to get their business up. They also convinced me to record an Instagram video, and then they tagged me in a picture where I wasn't even wearing one of their caps. But being nice gets you very far. I actually reshared that one. Then I looked at the image. I acted my own image. I wasn't wearing their cap that time. Anyways, so according to Abu Yusuf, if the person who got the work done, like the stitching, they gave the cloth, they're harif, they deal in this kind of thing, then their claim that it was done for free would not be accepted. And that has a basis of reason as well. Imam Muhammad said that if the one who did the work, like the tailor, is known that they do this kind of work for pay, then his word is accepted that no, it was for pay, right? Because that is the evident thing. You go to, would someone stitch something to you for free at their store? You'd have to give proof that it's not for pay. And Khawarizada and others said the fatwa here is on the position of Imam Muhammad, the third position mentioned. Right? And then there is, we looked, of course, that a contract, the sales contract, if it's corrupt, right? Al-aqd al-fasid, what is due in it? The qima, right? The qima, not the thaman, right? Right? Unless fixed and so on, right? It still needs to be fixed, but what's due in the aqd al-fasid is the qima. In a corrupt sale is the market price, not the agreed upon price. But both parties have the duty to amend so that it's no longer corrupt or cancel, right? And both parties have the right, both the responsibility and the right of cancellation. Correction would be by mutual agreement. Same thing applies to ijara contracts, the contracts of hire. So he says, وَالْوَاجِبُ فِي الْإِجَارَةِ الْفَاسِدَةِ أَجْرُ الْمِثْلِ. What's required in a corrupt ijara is the market value of the hire لا يتجاوز به المسمى. But you cannot go beyond the named price. Right? How? So, let's say, how would a contract be makruh? Would be how would a contract of hire be fasid? Is mentioned in the Majalla, item 460 and 461 and thereabouts. Right? Similar. Right? And it's mentioned in the Dur al-Mukhtar that it's basically an example of that would be, if we didn't specify, the duration of the hire. I'm hiring your cottage for $500. Now, تصحح العقود بقدر الإمكان. Now, usually, what's the typical minimum period for renting a cottage? We say a weekend. Or we look at the market rate. Like for $500, is it conceivable that a cottage would be rented for a month? No. So we try to validate it. But if something said that I'm renting this cottage for $120, we say, what would the assumption be? Would be the guy was drunk, because he can't rent a cottage for $120. But let's say, okay, the minimum unit we'd assume would be 1 day. Because it's conceivable that a cottage in Ontario would be rented for $120 for a whole weekend? Between strangers, like as a favor to a friend or whatever. Right? So contracts are validated to the extent possible. Right? But if the contract of hire is corrupt, then what's due is the market rate, but because they did agree on an amount, then you cannot go beyond that amount. Right? An example, وإن قبض المستأجر الدار فعليه الأجرة وإن لم يسكنها. If the person who rents a property takes possession of it, then they have to pay its rent even if they didn't end up staying in it. Why? Because they had the ability to stay in it. Right? If they then weren't able to, then they would have to seek cancellation, for example. فإن غصبها غاصب من يده سقطت الأجرة. Right? If someone wrongfully took the property from them, right, then they don't have to pay for it. How? I was going to rent that cottage and I was given the key. But then some squatters came and they're squatting in the cottage. Do I have to pay for their squatting? No, because my usage of it is an amana. So I don't have to compensate for someone else misappropriating it. I rented the car, they gave me the keys, so then I went to have lunch before I drove away with the car, and some kids decided to hack into the electronic system of the car and drive it for the weekend. I don't have to pay rent for it because the item that's hired is an amana. It's not my fault that it was stolen. Right? Unless it was due to my negligence. Right? وإن وجد بها عيبا يضر بالسكنة فله الفسخ. If one finds in the property a fault, a aib, a defect that negatively affects staying in it, then you are allowed to cancel. So here, you can, if the first issue of when payment is due for a house, etc. You can look at item 470 of the Majalla, and here, khiyarul aib, the option of cancellation due to defect, applies to contracts of hire. You can see that in item 513. Of course, not everything has to be taken literally. Not everything can ever be taken literally in books of fiqh, because, for example, they mention in khiyar al-aib that amongst the things that are aib, if you hire a servant, is if they are of one of the Islamic sects. That's obviously very contextual, right? Because it would depend on the society you're talking about, right? That what's a aib is that which is customarily considered a aib, right? Because, in some place, for example, you hire, and it would depend significantly on custom. So, but the aib is, right? This is if this is a aib that affects the ability to stay in it. How? That you bought this, you rented this beautiful property that overlooks a canyon, but now the property is rickety. We used to go visit this town, I forget what the town was in Spain, and there was property. I refused to go inside because half the house was built overhanging this canyon. I said, great, good for you, you guys go see it. It says, it could fall. It has been there for several hundred years. I said, good, so now it's more likely to fall. And they used to all make fun of me. I still hold that it's a very rational thing to do. Like, there's no reason to take that risk. I'd never walk on glass on CN Tower. Like, what's the benefit? Anyways, so this is where you're not able to live anymore in it, right? Without harm, right? فإن خربت الدار, if the house becomes ruined, it fell into the canyon. أو انقطع شرب الضيعة, right? Or access to water has been completely cut off from the land. Can someone live in a property if there's no water coming there anymore? Right? أو انقطع الماء من الرحى انفسخت الإجارة. Right? Or there's no water coming through the raha, the water mill, such that now you could live there, but can you live without water? No. And it's not temporary or fixable. Then does it become cancelled, or do you acquire the right of cancellation? And it appears that fatwa position is you acquire the right of cancellation. Then you can read it in the contract, right? And here, item 472 of the Majalla is very useful. Okay, so what if let's say that there's a random brother named Yaqub who rented this place with a friend, and then they decided to go on tabligh. They left the keys at Seekers. I said, you know what? I'm in a bit of trouble at home. I'm going to stay in their house. Right? Can they demand rent from me? The answer is no. Because it wasn't up for renting. But let's say that I went to a hotel. I got a hotel key. And I know the guy at the hotel counter is totally incompetent. They don't know how to use the system. So I decided to stay a few extra days in Istanbul. So I go into the hotel, check there was no one else in the hotel. Terrible hotel, but nothing's nicer than free. I swipe it on the room thing and it's open. I stay another 3 days. Do I have to pay for it? What's the difference between I stayed at someone's house without their permission? Do I have to pay contractually? That's case A. Case B is I freeloaded in a hotel room for 3 days. Here, poor Mr. Kilo doesn't get a gram of rent. But here, I'll have to pay, even if, and the difference is, explained in Majalla item 472, that if you use the property of another without a contract, then if that property was set aside specifically for earning from it, such as it's a hotel room, it's up for rent, or one of these buildings, it's a rental unit. I moved in, then I have to pay for it. And there's some details. And of course, in all cases, it's sinful. It's sinful, and here, in this case, it'd be sinful and it'd be recommended for me to give something as an expression of my item 507 of the Majalla, the one renting has the option of cancellation upon, has khiyar al-ru'ya, has the option of cancellation upon inspection. And a lot of people don't realize that. Now, of course, if you open a Muslim hotel, for example, a Muslim opens a hotel, spend a little bit of time finding out about the rules related to these things, so you can be in accordance. Because sometimes something small, and there's ways you could deal with it, and not get yourself into situations where your earnings are questionable, right? And the wisdom of it is obvious. I can give from my own example. I decided to check out this micro hotel room at Gatwick Airport. It's called a YOLO Hotel or something. I couldn't pray in the room. Had I seen the room, I would have said, sorry, it won't work for me. I had to actually move all my belongings into the little shower corner in order to have, even then there wasn't enough space to pray like just a regular sujood. Right? I fell off I tried to get off the bed, I missed the step. I didn't get myself hurt, but I almost bashed my head against the wall. It was quite clumsy. It's tiny, right? So, the option of inspection is a right. And then we'll see how you cancel a contract, right? How you cancel a contract. And then we'll move on to shufa. Now, shufa, we're going to cover very quickly, because shufa, intercession, here, or this is not intercession, it's the right of preemption. The basic idea of the right of preemption is that if your neighbor sells their property, you have the right to preempt the sale before someone else buys the property, right? Now, Islamically, it's also to preserve neighborhoods, right? And the specific rulings may not apply to you, it's not binding upon you in this sense. But there's akhlaq related to it, that if you're going to sell a property, at least offer it to your neighbor. If the neighbor can match the selling price, they have rights over you. Because they may want a child or someone to move in, etc. And this had many wisdoms. So we'll look at that, and so there are many applications to it, but we'll try to do it fast, and then we'll come to partnerships. To partnerships, and that is of significance, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And then the remaining chapters, we'll stop there. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.